In 1878, in a mining settlement that had existed for less than 2 years and already held over 3,000 men, a woman walked onto a dance floor at 10 o'clock at night. She danced until 4 in the morning. Every dance, with men who had not bathed in weeks, with men who were drunk before they reached the floor, with men whose grip on her arm was harder than it needed to be. She smiled through all of it, because the management required the smile as a condition of employment. When the music finally stopped and the last customer was pushed toward the door, she sat down on a bench near the back wall, removed her shoes, and held her own feet in her hands for a long time. She did not speak. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you are about to hear is not the version most people know. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe. We do not tell the comfortable version. And here is a question before we begin. When you picture a dancehall girl from the Wild West era, what do you actually see? Leave it in the comments. Because whatever image comes to mind was constructed deliberately, and it was constructed to make you feel a specific thing, and that specific thing was not the truth. The hurdy-gurdy girls, the percentage girls, the dance hall women, the names shifted by region and by decade and by what a given establishment wanted to call the arrangement. But the function was consistent. These women danced with customers. They kept customers buying drinks. They maintained a specific atmosphere, festive, available, unthreatening, that was commercially necessary for the establishments that employed them. And they did this for hours every night, in physical conditions that were genuinely brutal, under social and economic conditions that kept most of them from leaving. The official distinction between a dance hall and a brothel mattered in certain legal contexts. It mattered for licensing. It mattered for the social self-presentation of establishments that wanted to operate in a particular part of town without triggering specific kinds of official attention. A dance hall, officially, employed women to dance. What the women did outside those hours in private arrangements was technically a separate matter outside the house's formal responsibility. This distinction was maintained with care. It was also, in practice, almost entirely fictional. The economic pressure on the women in these establishments was structured specifically by the percentage system. A woman earned money based on how much alcohol her customers purchased while in her company. Every drink a customer bought for her, or for himself while dancing with her, returned a percentage, often 10 cents on a 50-cent drink, sometimes less. Her income for the night was a direct function of how successfully she could keep men in the building, engaged and spending, which meant that her actual job was not dancing. Her job was psychological management of men who were intoxicated, who were lonely, who were operating under a set of assumptions about what the dance implied that she was required to navigate without triggering a confrontation that would be costly to everyone. She had to read every man who approached her, his state of intoxication, his level of volatility, what he expected from the transaction, and calibrate her response in real time to keep him spending money without creating a situation that would require the management's involvement. That is skilled work. It was not acknowledged as skilled work. But here is the problem. The boundary between the official function and the unofficial one eroded quickly and completely in most establishments. A woman earning $8 or $10 a week in percentages, paying for her room, her costume, her meals, her medicine, her laundry out of those earnings, was running a deficit in most weeks. The offers that came with more money were not hypothetical. They were constant, and management, which maintained the official fiction with one hand, often facilitated the unofficial reality with the other, because the unofficial reality was also profitable, and the fiction was only worth maintaining up to the point where it created actual economic loss. A woman who had arrived at one of these establishments hoping that the official description would hold, who understood over the course of her first weeks that the official description was a framework rather than a reality, had almost no good options. She had spent what money she had getting there. She owed for the costume and the room. She was in a settlement where the alternative employment for a woman without connections consisted of laundry work and domestic service, both of which paid less. She stayed, and she adapted to what the situation actually was. And this is where things change. Because the physical cost of the work accumulated faster than most accounts acknowledge. Start with the feet. A woman dancing for 10 or 12 hours on wooden floors in heeled boots or decorative slippers designed for appearance rather than support experienced damage that was continuous and compounding. Blisters that formed and broke and reformed on the same pressure points. Structural damage to the bones of the foot from repeated impact without adequate support. Women who walked with notable difficulty during daylight hours when the performance requirement was temporarily suspended were not unusual in these establishments. The rest of the body followed. Continuous energetic dancing in rooms filled with burning oil lamps and the body heat of several hundred people was heat exposure sustained for hours. The ventilation in frontier buildings was inadequate as a matter of course. A woman sweating through her costume by the second hour of a shift that had 4 more hours remaining was experiencing dehydration and heat stress in conditions where stopping to recover was not an option. The noise was its own damage. The volume of a frontier entertainment establishment at full capacity, music, voices, the general roar of a crowd operating at maximum density, sustained for hours, night after night, produced hearing damage in women who worked these floors for extended periods. It was gradual, it was not dramatic, and it was permanent once it reached a certain threshold. But it gets worse. Alcohol was not optional. A woman who refused to drink with customers was refusing the mechanism by which she earned money because the percentage came from the drink, and the drink required her active participation in its purchase. She could negotiate in some cases for a watered drink instead of a full one. Establishments that were slightly more careful about maintaining a functional workforce sometimes allowed this, but she could not decline entirely. And the alcohol consumed across a shift, night after night, over weeks and months and years, reorganized her body around its presence. Dependency developed faster than most of the women involved recognized while it was happening. By the time the pattern was visible, the difficulty of starting the evening without a drink, the physical symptoms when access was delayed, the way the dependency was shaping decisions that had nothing to do with the drink itself, the dependency was already established well enough that addressing it required more than willpower in conditions where the substance was being pressed on her as a job requirement. Management was not uninformed about this process. Management in many establishments encouraged it. A woman who had developed a dependency on alcohol provided by the establishment was a woman who was not going to voluntarily leave. She was a woman who was going to show up because the substance was there, and the substance was now a necessity. The dependency was, from the perspective of the operation, a form of retention that cost almost nothing to maintain. And here is the first question worth stopping for. What were the actual alternatives? Not abstractly, but specifically, what could a woman in this situation have done instead? She could have tried laundry work. Laundry work on the frontier was physically brutal in ways that are difficult to overstate. heavy wet fabric lifted and wrung and hung by hand, in water that had to be hauled and heated for hours at a stretch, for wages that were consistently below what even the dance hall's percentage system produced in a reasonable week. It damaged hands, it damaged backs, and it was available only to women who already had the stamina and the physical capacity that laundry required, which was not guaranteed for women who had been through other difficult situations before arriving at the frontier. She could have tried domestic service, which meant cooking and cleaning and child care for a family that might pay $3 or $4 a month, might dismiss her without notice or reference for reasons entirely unrelated to her performance, and offered almost no path toward accumulating anything that would change her situation. She could have tried marriage, which required a man willing to marry her, which required a man who either did not know about her current situation or was indifferent to it, both of which narrowed the field considerably in communities where information traveled fast and where the social categories were enforced with consistency. The dance hall was, for many of the women who worked in them, not the worst available option. That is a specific and uncomfortable truth. The worst available options were the street, which offered a faster version of the same destruction, and pure destitution, which was also available. The dance hall was a step above those options. The step was real. The conditions of the step were still damaging in the ways already described. And this is where things change again, because the women who worked these floors were not interchangeable or anonymous from each other's perspective, even if they were from the establishment's perspective. Networks formed. Women who shared a building, who worked the same floor night after night, who understood each other's situations in ways that no one outside could fully access. Those women formed bonds. They warned each other about specific customers whose behavior was dangerous. They passed information about which establishments in which settlements had better conditions and which had worse. They helped each other with the small practical things that the structure of their situation made difficult, covering for someone who was sick, managing a situation that was escalating, providing the kind of presence that meant someone was not alone in a moment that was bad. These networks are almost invisible in the historical record because no one at the time thought to document them as networks. They appear in the margins of other things, a note in a coroner's report about who was present, a reference in a legal document to several women from the same establishment appearing together in a specific context, a letter that mentions a specific woman in a specific place in terms that imply a close and sustained relationship. The documentation is incidental, but it is there. The age range of the women working these establishments is another thing the popular mythology consistently misrepresents. The floor of these establishments was not populated primarily by women in their mid-20s. Girls in their mid-teens worked these floors in settlements where enforcement mechanisms were weak or absent or actively arranged to look the other way. A settlement sheriff whose ongoing arrangement with the house owner was a financial relationship rather than a regulatory one was not going to enforce age restrictions that the house owner had no interest in maintaining. The recruitment for these establishments followed the same patterns as recruitment for other frontier labor: word of mouth, advertisements, agents who traveled circuits and made offers to women in depressed mill communities farther east. The offers sounded reasonable in the abstract. The reality of the percentage system, the debt for the costume, the dependency that would develop, the actual conditions of the work, none of those appeared in the pitch. They appeared after arrival, after the woman was already in the territory, already in the building, already starting to understand the arithmetic. Management turnover in these establishments was also faster than it appeared from outside. Women who deteriorated past a certain point, who were too visibly damaged by the work to maintain the required performance, too obviously sick, too unreliable because of alcohol dependency, too aged out of what the customers of a particular establishment expected, were replaced. The replacement happened without ceremony. The frontier produced a continuous supply of women with no options and enough desperation to take any available work. The exit from these establishments was rarely clean or chosen. It was usually deterioration to the point of replacement. What happened to women after the establishments were done with them is a piece of this history that almost no one has assembled in any systematic way. Some found ways to keep working in diminished capacities inside the same buildings, cleaning, cooking, running small errands. Some married when the opportunity aligned, usually to men whose circumstances were also limited. Some moved on to other settlements where the pattern would repeat under slightly different conditions. The mortality rate among women who worked these floors for extended periods was significant in ways that the records understate, because the records were not kept with accuracy or consistency. Disease, tuberculosis, moved through the close quarters of these buildings with no resistance, and it was only one of several infectious diseases that circulated without adequate check. The physical damage from years of the work itself, the alcohol dependency leading toward its own destination. Women who had worked these floors for 5 or 6 years were often not, at that point, women in their early 30s. They were women whose bodies had processed a longer timeline of damage than their age suggested. And here is the final question. When you watch the Western film, and the dancehall girl appears, spinning on the floor, skirts moving, smiling at the camera, everything about her suggesting a woman doing something she enjoys. What is that image actually showing you? It is showing you the performance, the part, the job required. The smile that was not optional, the energy that could not be turned off, the appearance of someone who is having a good time rather than someone who is doing something that is destroying her on a schedule she cannot see clearly from the inside. The woman sitting on the bench at 4 a.m, holding her feet in her hands, not speaking, she existed in every establishment that ever ran a dance floor in the frontier era. She existed every single night. The choice to cut away before the music stops, to keep the frame on the spinning dress and the mandatory smile, is a choice about what this history is allowed to look like. Mystery Wild West makes a different choice, and that is where we leave it today. The violence in these establishments was not the cinematic kind. It was not dramatic confrontations with clear winners and losers. It was the quieter, more pervasive kind, a woman who misread a customer's state and triggered anger that had no good outlet. A man who had decided that the transaction implied more than the transaction included. The bruise that appeared on a Tuesday and was covered as best it could be covered by Wednesday night when the shift started again. This violence was not reported to any authority in any systematic way because the authority that would have received the report had arrangements with the house and was not going to be useful. The violence was absorbed. It was managed. It was treated as a condition of the environment, like the dust or the noise. The law enforcement reality in most frontier settlements where these establishments operated was not the impartial authority that the era's mythology suggests. Sheriffs and marshals who had ongoing financial arrangements with saloon and dance hall operators were not going to investigate complaints originating from inside those establishments. A woman who attempted to bring a complaint to the sheriff was approaching a man whose income included payments from the person she was complaining about. The outcome of that approach was predictable, and most women who had been in the establishment for any length of time had already predicted it and stopped approaching. Consider what the daily experience of this life looked like from the inside, specifically. Rising in the afternoon because the shift ended in the early morning hours. Eating something. The food provided by the establishment ranged from adequate to barely functional, and what it cost came off the wages. Getting into the costume, which required the corset and the heeled shoes and the specific presentation that the management required, regardless of the state of the feet or the back or the general condition of the body. Beginning the shift at whatever time the floor opened. Working through the hours that followed, the dancing, the drinks, the management of every man in the room, the maintenance of the smile, the performance of availability and enthusiasm that the job required, whether or not the body had the resources for it. Ending at some point in the early morning. Returning to the room. Beginning again the following day. There was no day off in most of these operations during peak season. Peak season, in a mining or cattle settlement, was most of the year. The off-season, if there was one, brought reduced income along with reduced demands, which meant the deficit in the ledger widened rather than closed. And this is where we arrive at the question that belongs at the end of this. What did the dancehall girl mythology erase, specifically? Not in general terms, but in concrete ones. It erased the feet. It erased the 12-hour shift. It erased the percentage system and what that system required of the women operating inside it. It erased the alcohol dependency that was structurally built into the work. It erased the violence that was quiet and routine and absorbed rather than confronted. It erased the age of the youngest women on the floor. It erased the trajectory. What happened to these women over years? What the work produced in the body over time, where they ended up when the establishment was done with them. In the place of all of that, the mythology installed a figure who was colorful, who seemed to be enjoying herself, who was in some vague sense free, choosing this unconventional path because of some unconventional quality in her nature. The painted dress, the ready smile, the suggestion of a woman living outside the rules in a way that was adventurous rather than constrained. That figure never existed in the way the mythology describes her. She was a construct. She was useful to the people who built her, the operators who preferred customers to think of the establishment as entertainment rather than exploitation, the customers who preferred to think of themselves as participants in an adventure rather than participants in a system, the towns that preferred to think of these establishments as color rather than as the mechanism through which women were ground up to produce the revenue that kept the frontier economy moving. The woman sitting on the bench at 4 a.m, not speaking, holding her feet, she was the actual story. And the actual story was not comfortable enough to sell. Mystery Wild West does not sell the comfortable version, and that is where we leave it today. The settlements that built themselves on this system, the cattle towns, the mining camps, the rail stops that grew into communities, did not build monuments to the women who worked the dance floors. They built monuments to the men who owned the land, who ran the cattle operations, who held the claims, the economic infrastructure of the Frontier Entertainment District, which generated significant revenue for surrounding businesses and for the settlement as a whole, was not acknowledged as part of what built the town. It was acknowledged as something that happened to exist in a particular district that the town benefited from but did not need to claim, that the respectable part of the settlement could view with a certain fastidious distance while simultaneously depending on the economic activity it produced. The women inside that infrastructure were as invisible as the infrastructure itself. They were present every night. They were essential to the commercial model. They were generating money that flowed into the economy of the settlement in ways that touched every business on the main street, and they were treated in the official memory of the place as though they had not been there at all. The cemeteries tell the story that the official memory does not. The sections reserved for people who died outside the structure of respectable community, the women from the houses and the dance floors, the men who died in ways that excluded them from regular burial, those sections at the edges of frontier cemeteries have markers that are incomplete, first names only in some cases, no name at all in others, ages that are estimates, origins listed as unknown. A woman who worked a dance floor in a Montana settlement for 3 years, who died of tuberculosis complications at the age of 28, was buried in the eastern section of the local cemetery in the winter of 1882. The grave marker gave a first name and the year. Nothing else was recorded. The woman who had danced with every miner who came through the doors for 3 years, who had kept men drinking and spending in a building that contributed significantly to the local economy, who had navigated the violence and the dependency and the physical cost of the work and kept showing up, that woman got a first name on a wooden marker that may not have survived the next decade. That is the end of the Dancehall girl story, not the spinning dress and the smile in the frame. The wooden marker with one name at the edge of a field in a place that forgot her as efficiently as it had used her. The history that actually happened was not entertaining in the way the mythology was entertaining. It was harder to look at. It required acknowledging things about what the frontier was that the popular mythology had been specifically constructed to avoid acknowledging. It required seeing the women on the dance floor not as colorful background figures in someone else's adventure, but as people doing specific labor under specific conditions for specific economic and structural reasons that had almost nothing to do with choice and almost everything to do with the absence of anything better available. That is the history, not the other one. Mystery Wild West does not look away from it, and that is where we leave it today. There is another dimension of the dancehall experience that rarely enters the historical record with any specificity: the relationship between these women and the musicians who played the floors where they worked. The musicians were themselves often in precarious situations. They played for wages that were low, in conditions that were loud and smoky and lasted deep into the night, and their continued employment depended on their ability to maintain energy and tempo through hours that would exhaust most people. But they had a kind of mobility that the women on the floor did not have. A musician could move between establishments, between settlements, between regions. He could leave. The women could not leave with the same ease, and both parties knew it. The music was also a form of pressure. A slow song gave a woman and a customer less to do than a fast one, more space for conversation that might go in directions the woman could not fully control. The tempo was set by management, not by the women. Another element of the environment that the women navigated rather than controlled. A woman who had been working one of these floors for 2 years had developed skills that no other employment on the frontier required or would have taught her. She could assess a room in seconds and identify which configurations of customers were likely to produce problems before those problems developed. She could manage 3 conversations simultaneously while tracking the physical states of multiple men whose states were relevant to her safety and income. She could transition from warmth to distance to warmth again without visible seam, in response to cues that she was reading continuously. She could maintain a performance of availability and enthusiasm through physical states that would have shut down that performance in anyone not trained by the specific demands of this work. These were not trivial capabilities. They represented genuine expertise. And they were expertise that, outside this specific context, had almost no recognized economic value. A woman who had spent 2 years on a frontier dance floor could not list that on an application for domestic service. She could not reference the skills she had developed in any context where those skills would be understood as skills. She was, to the outside economy, simply a woman with a 2-year gap in a history she could not explain. The transition out of dancehall work was therefore shaped by the same dynamics that shaped the transition out of every other frontier occupation that women in difficult situations were pushed into. The past had to be hidden. A new surface had to be constructed from whatever materials were available, a new name, a new story, a new settlement, where no one knew the previous one. Some women managed this. Some did not. The ones who did managed it through a combination of discipline and luck that was not systematically available and could not be relied upon as a general exit mechanism. The ones who did not manage it stayed until the establishment was done with them, or until the settlement itself changed enough that the establishment closed or changed its character. Both things happened. Mining towns exhausted their veins and emptied in months. Cattle towns lost their rail connections and declined in years. The establishments that had operated in those places closed or relocated. The women who had been working them either relocated with the economic activity or were left in places that were no longer generating the revenue that had justified their presence. The relocations were difficult. A woman who moved with an establishment from one settlement to the next carried the same situation with her to a new location. The ledger came with her. The debt did not reset at the new location. The costume debt might be renegotiated slightly or might not. The percentage system operated the same way in the new place as in the old one. She was not starting over. She was continuing in a different geography. The women who were left behind when an operation relocated had a more immediately dangerous situation. A settlement that was emptying did not have the economic activity to support any kind of employment. The domestic service positions and the laundry work that were the alternative options in functional settlements did not exist in emptying ones. A woman left in a declining mining camp when the dance hall closed was in a situation that had no good resolution available and several bad ones. And here is the thing that connects all of these strands into a single point. The dance hall, the brothel, the mail-order bride situation, the asylum. These were not separate social problems that happened to coexist in the same era. They were different outputs of the same system. A system that placed women in conditions of extreme legal and economic vulnerability, that provided almost no mechanism for exit from bad situations, that attributed the outcomes of those conditions to the character of the individual women rather than to the design of the system, and that constructed a cultural mythology around the whole arrangement that made it entertaining rather than visible. The women on the dance floors were not there because they had made an unconventional choice. They were there because the system that surrounded them had produced a set of options in which this was among the least bad ones available at the specific moment when they needed to choose. The entertainment mythology says they were colorful, free, interesting. The actual conditions say they were tired, in debt, dependent, and working in a job that was systematically destroying the body doing the work. Both things were true at the same time, in the sense that the women were also sometimes capable of finding moments of genuine human connection and even enjoyment within the conditions they were in. Human beings do that. They find the livable moments inside unlivable structures. That does not make the structure livable. It makes the human beings inside it resilient in ways that are genuinely worth acknowledging, while being careful not to let the acknowledgement of their resilience become a way of making the structure disappear. The structure is still there. The structure is what needs to be looked at, and looking at it clearly, without the romantic overlay that the mythology installed, is what Mystery Wild West is here to do. That is where we leave it today. There is one final element of this history that deserves its own moment before we close. The women who worked these floors were, in many cases, the primary economic support of someone else, not just themselves, families that depended on the money they sent back east. A mother in a difficult situation who received a monthly contribution, a younger sibling whose schooling was being paid for with money earned on a frontier dance floor. These contributions rarely appeared in any official record. They were private transactions in an era when wire transfers did not exist, and sending money required physical cash through mail that was sometimes lost. But they were real. And they represent a dimension of the story that the mythology has never had space for. The idea that a woman working a frontier dance floor might be doing so not just for her own survival, but for the survival of people who were entirely dependent on her income, and who in most cases had no idea what the income was costing her to produce. The performance extended in both directions. She performed for the customers in the building, and she performed, in the letter's home, a version of her situation that her family could receive without it destroying the relationship. She was fine. The work was hard, but manageable. The territory was rough, but she was managing. The money would come next month. The performance in the letters was as skillful as the performance on the floor, and it served a purpose that was more important to her than the performance on the floor. Because the floor performance kept her alive, the letter performance kept the connection alive. And the connection, the sister in Pennsylvania, the mother in Cincinnati, the people who knew her name and cared whether she was well, was one of the few things that the system could not reprice, could not add to the ledger, could not take away through the mechanism that took away everything else. That connection was maintained through letters that did not tell the truth, because the truth would have ended the connection or made it into something terrible. And the management of that distance, that silence, that carefully sustained fiction of a life that was something other than what it was, that was the final and perhaps most demanding performance of all. Mystery Wild West does not replace that silence with a comfortable story. It names it, it acknowledges it, and it leaves the space for what that silence actually contained. And that is where we leave it today.